Today we are going to discuss the entire history of Bahariterra, or sometimes called the Islamic Republic of the Bahariterra Islands. Okay, let's get to it. In the early 1500s, a 15-year-old boy was considered a man in many places around the world, and in the early 1500s, during an unknown date and unknown time, it's not recorded or exactly known, history goes that a boy named Banda Bermudez became a pirate who called himself the Captain Banda Bermudez the First, because, he would later go on to name a kid after himself. Now, Banda Bermudez, at age 15, had built up quite a record. Since he had turned to like 13 probably, no one knows exactly, but for the last couple years, he had been a pirate already. And what he did by the time he was 15 was incredible. And this is how the Bahariterra Islands became what they are today. Everything because of this one 15-year-old kid who deeply influenced history. So Banda Bermudez, at an unknown time in the early 1500s, when he was 15 years old, he decided, because he was a pirate and he had a lot of connections, he was in the Indian Ocean, right? Portugal used to dominate the Indian Ocean. All the spices, all the herbs, all the valuable goods, Portugal controlled the Indian Ocean in the 1500s and 1600s, right? So, Banda Bermudez out in the Indian Ocean was a pirate who stole a lot of the money and valuable goods that Europe was extracting from that region. He made a lot of money, and the British, the Portuguese, a lot of countries in Western Europe wanted him dead. So he had to go into hiding. He planned to live under a fake identity in America. But things didn't go as planned, and here's where our story begins. A 15-year-old man named Captain Banda Bermudez stole a bunch of Spanish and Portuguese ships with some of his friends from Spain and Portugal and began a journey to try some more piracy. Captain Banda Bermudez sailed south past the southern tip of Africa in modern-day South Africa, and then he turned north into the Indian Ocean. Captain Banda Bermudez was looking for more ships to pillage and plunder in the Indian Ocean, and it was an important trade route where very powerful people like Tamil dynasties and the Arab merchants and everyone would sell riches. Captain Banda Bermudez kidnapped a bunch of Swahili-speaking Eastern African people from the east coast of Africa and forced them into slavery. He would use their labor to build and provision ships, and to help him make maps, as well as dig holes to bury some of the treasures that he buried. Had to get rid of it because it was wanted and people were onto him that he would steal these treasures. So sometimes he'd have to bury it to hide it, make it disappear, and come back for it. He grew very close to some of the captive people who he had kidnapped in Eastern Africa, and many of the slaves eventually ended up just becoming his friends, like Stockholm Syndrome. They became friends with Captain Banda Bermudez. Now, sometime during this period in the early 1500s, when Captain Banda Bermudez was sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, Captain Banda Bermudez was on his way to North America, trying to escape the Portuguese government because, like many Western European countries, they wanted to arrest him since he had committed so many bad crimes and he was wanted by the Portuguese. They wanted to take him to court and execute him or whatever. Captain Banda Bermudez sailed fast across the Atlantic. Eventually, instead of arriving in America to live under a false identity and start a new life, he stumbled upon a small mountainous archipelago. Alright, he had a small island on a coral reef, and his ship was crashed on this island, and it was like in a shallow lagoon with some coral. And behind this small island, on the other side, he could see across the island, he could see the water on the other side. Behind it was a much bigger mountainous island. Captain Banda Bermudez became the first known person in recorded history, as of now, to discover the islands of Bahariterra. After finding the Bahariterran archipelago, Captain Banda Bermudez he thought that he accidentally wound up in South America and that the winds blew him off course. He began roaming the woods looking for native tribal people who could help him. Because he didn't have so much geographical knowledge of North America. He thought he was somewhere near Rio, near a coastal mountain range, and that the Amazon was there, which it's not near Rio, Brazil. Right? So Captain Banda Bermudez had wrecked his ship on the eastern shore of Bahariterra Islands. Okay, Captain Banda Bermudez heard a bunch of the wild birds calling in the forest, and he thought it was demons and that they were going to take him to hell because he was a pirate and he killed people and stole so much money. He got so scared, in fact, that he ordered a bunch of his crew to burn the rainforest, the deep, dark, scary forest, right? No, it was a beautiful, biodiverse forest. And he ordered his crew to burn the rainforest to try to scare the so-called demons away. The smoke from Captain Banda Bermudez's fire was so thick and so dark that the jet stream just carried it east across the Atlantic, and parts of it ended up in the mountains of Portugal. But no one ever knew it was him that caused all this smoke all the way in Portugal. It looked like regular clouds. They were high atmosphere smoke, Wildfire smoke can travel around the earth. Well, the smoke from Captain Banda Bermudez's fire was so thick that some of it ended up in Portugal. And that could have got him caught if someone managed to somehow trace it back to Bahariterra, but everyone thought it was just clouds, luckily, probably. So, yeah, there's not a lot of history or any books we could find on what happened with that, but we do know that the smoke from his fire was so thick it made it to Portuguese mountains. Alright? So, Captain Banda Bermudez was getting so much trouble from some East African people, the Swahili, that he had kidnapped but kind of made his friends, who he wanted to be his slaves. The Portuguese and Spanish pirates that he had in his crew, along with the Swahili enslaved people, and him became the first to colonize Bahariterra. And slavery was made illegal because the Swahili people tried to start an uprising. They were so sick of working and working, not getting paid and nothing. Captain Banda Bermudez made several more trips to the Indian Ocean for piracy, and he would end up bringing home his new friends he'd make on these adventures. Arab merchants and other people who came with him as his companions. So Arabs, Persians, and Tamil, South Indian people, they would come back to Bahariterra with him. And that is how Bahariterra has Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, and it's a predominantly Arabian and South Asian and Central Asian and North African country. People from all over the Muslim and Hindu countries and areas around the Indian Ocean ended up settling Bahariterra because of this. So there was large numbers of these people from South Asia, places like Pakistan, Iran, and India by 1627. In the year 1630, Arabs and Persians made up a significant percent of the portion of Bahariterra. And by the way, Bahariterra got its name because Swahili people kept saying the Swahili word for ocean, Bahari, because they kept trying to make plans to escape. Some of them wanted to try to go back to Africa across the ocean, the Bahari. The Portuguese kept hearing it. They called it Bahari land. The Portuguese and Spanish word for land is terra. So the name Bahariterra stuck ever since, and it literally basically means land in the ocean. And that is not an incorrect statement about Bahariterra's islands, okay? Bahariterra is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean on all sides. Bahariterra is around 1,000 or so miles from the mainland in North America, and to this day, Indian and Persian culture, as well as Portuguese and Arabic language and many others from across Europe, North Africa, and Asia can be found in Bahariterra. And you can see it written into stones and carved into bricks in some of the historical neighborhoods in Banda, Bahariterra, and Newport Banda, Bahariterra. But Bahariterra even has its own language, which is kind of like a common language that formed for all these different ethnic groups to communicate. It's called Tualaim, aka Bahariterran, which is very hard to learn for sure. Bahariterra's buildings, they follow architectural style similar to Bermuda and the USA combined. Many homes in Bahariterra have Bermudian roofs or American-type roofs with shingles. Bermuda was discovered by another captain whose last name was Bermudez from Spain, and it's just pure coincidence. All right. Now, Captain Banda Bermudez had a son who became Captain Banda Bermudez Jr. He didn't do so much piracy. He was a lot less of a criminal kind. He was more fair, and he became like the first kind of like king or leader or president of Bahariterra. We don't know if you'd call him a king or what you call him. A dictator? Is a dictator ever fair? Because this guy was fair and everyone kind of loved him. But Captain Banda Bermudez too kind of inherited that job as the boss and the captain of this new country after his pirate father passed away. And he was the one who continued to bring more and more people from Pakistan, Iran, India, East Africa, and Arabia to Bahariterra. Those places in the Indian Ocean, specifically the part of the Indian Ocean known as the Arabian Sea, he'd meet people there, he'd save people from other pirate sea groups who wanted to be killed by pirates because they were merchants. They'd move to Bahariterra. Some people would come to Bahariterra as a halfway stop while crossing the Atlantic, and they'd think the islands are so beautiful that once they're done going on whatever journey they were going on, when they stopped in Bahariterra, they would come back to Bahariterra again. So that is how Bahariterra ended up with people from all over Asia, Africa, and Europe. Like pretty much the whole entire old world, Eurasia and Africa, you know? Alright, so the Bahariterra Islands' next course of history would start many years later. After hundreds of years of waves of immigrants coming and people having kids and settling the land, you know, cities and villages popped up all over the archipelago, natural roads began to form where people trampled the bush. Bahariterra was being colonized like this, slowly being developed, but surely over hundreds of years. Even in the early 1900s, Bahariterra wasn't really a fully developed and settled island country yet. And there were still much more discoveries to be made, different waterfalls and stuff. People hadn't even mapped it out entirely. Bahariterra didn't even appear on many maps, even in the early 1900s, like 1909. It was still so unknown, right? So the Bahariterra Islands, next major point after the colonial point in history, you get into the communist and the oil boom point. So in the 1980s, basically from 1980 to say 1988 was the communist period in Bahariterra. And what happened is from the 1970s until the early 2000s, there was a 30-year period when the Bahariterra Islands would discover some oil, start extracting it from the land, making a lot of money, and run out. And then by luck, they just discover another oil reserve somewhere in the waters surrounding the archipelago. So the Bahariterra Islands kept having all these cool discoveries of oil that kept helping them get money and develop just a little more closer to becoming a first world country. This was going on from 1970 until the early 2000s. And during this time, what happened was in the 1980s, Bahariterra went for a brief communist period that lasted 8 years until 1988. It wasn't really a communist government, but there was a lot of communists and people who wanted Bahariterra to be a communist country within Bahariterra, and they were like starting riots, constantly trying to like overthrow the current government and just trying to bring communism to the Bahariterra Islands. Because this kind of country that was led by a selected leader, sometimes those votes, sometimes those passed through heritage, that had kind of been going on since Captain Bermudez discovered the place, it wasn't working anymore. But unfortunately, or fortunately, for better or for worse, by 1988, the communists' plans to take over Bahariterra failed when a troubled kid who had a troubled childhood, who had grew up to be a messed up man, who only goes by one name, Khalmed, and doesn't seem to have a last name. Khalmed took over the Bahariterra Islands in 1989 and started the Khalmed dictatorship, which lasted all the way until 2020 or 2021, when the dictatorship started to fall apart, and in like 2021, I believe, he got killed. And we'll get to that later, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, the Khalmad dictatorship started in 1989, but this oil that was being discovered and helping Bahariterra get better continued into the early 2000s. So all the people in Bahariterra were like, okay, look, this crazy guy took over the country. He's a little crazy. He's basically a dictator, but he's not threatening the U.S. It's not getting international news coverage. We're not making any enemies, and he's getting us really rich. And he was, except Khalmad might have been discovering more oil and using it to build and develop Bahariterra, but he was only doing that with a little bit of the money from discovering the oil. What people didn't seem to realize was that most of the money that was coming into Bahariterra went straight into Khalmad's pockets to benefit him, and he blowed on luxury cars that he never used and crazy stuff like that. And only a tiny bit of the money from all these major oil companies he basically owned was going to developing Bahariterra and making it a better island nation to live in. And no one wanted to recognize Bahariterra as a legitimate country because it was a small island nation that didn't appear on most maps, that literally just got taken over by a crazy dictator who takes the whole entire country's GDP per capita and uses it to buy cars. So obviously no one's gonna want to be an ally with this crazy guy. There was no use. It was just a small group of rocks in the ocean, in the eyes of most other countries near Bahariterra. So Bahariterra was never really recognized or traded with or on any diplomatic scale until the early 2000s. Sometime right around 9/11, but not connected to 9/11, it just happened to happen around the time 9/11 happened, Bahariterra and the United States were getting into all these arguments. Now, it was actually before 9/11, so we can't really say it was because the United States was a little paranoid about Islamic extremists or nothing. But you gotta remember that many of the people in Bahariterra might have been discovered by Europeans who also had some African people they enslaved on their ships who got freedom. But like all these waves of people from like Pakistan and Iran and Arabia and East Africa had been happening for a long time in India. So by this time, the early 2000s, Bahariterra is a rich cultural melting pot. There's Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs who practice Sikhism, all these different Eastern peoples who are nice, peaceful people, but sometimes don't get along. And they were all living close together. And what was happening was Muslims, being just like any Abrahamic religion, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, like all the other Abrahamic religions, they convert people to Islam, So Muslims were converting Hindus to Islam, teaching them how to be Muslims. And it was willful, nothing was forced, because Muslims mostly believe that Islam cannot be forced on others. But many Hindus were like, okay, this Muslim man come and he converts my wife and my sister to Islam. They leave Hinduism and they go marry him. Like people were losing their sisters and moms to these Muslim men who were converting Hindu women to Islam and marrying them. And the same thing's happening in India right now, and it's causing a lot of Hindus to get mad there. But this was Bahariterra in the early 2000s. What happened was there were these Hindu extremists who were killing Muslims, saying that Muslims had a plan to take over Bahariterra and make it Muslim-only country. This was before the rise of any Islamic groups that were radical and not really Muslims, such as ISIS, for example. And there was all this big conspiracy theory by these Hindu extremists that they had to destroy the Muslims in Bahariterra. And because all these Hindus were attacking Muslims, people were so scared they stopped being Muslims and stopped praying to God because they were getting discriminated against. And it caused some hardcore, firm believers in Islam to be like, the Hindus are attacking my people and changing them. So now we got radical Hindus, and then there was radical Muslims. They started fighting, and this later in the early 2000s triggered the Bahariterra religious war. But we're not going to talk about that here on YouTube. Now what happened was all these people in the United States realized that there's militant extremist groups just right off their East Coast. And if for whatever reason they wanted to, they could get on a speedboat, load it with bombs, and just go right up to like one of the beaches in New Jersey, or they could go right up the river, right into downtown Manhattan and just blow up. And this really scared the U.S. government. And this was the early 2000s. There were internet forums online. American religious groups, Christians and stuff were going online, and they tried to convert people to Christianity. It led to all these arguments with a few religious extremists in Bahariterra. They started threatening Americans. So this small minority group of a few religious extremists in Bahariterra started threatening Americans, and Americans, some of them, started threatening back. This was the early 2000s on the U.S. East Coast. Places like New York, there were gangsters and stuff who didn't frick around. There were threats going back and forth between just these small groups of people that literally caused the U.S. to be like, oh my goodness, this small island nation is a serious threat to the American people. And they didn't really take the action to condemn the religious extremist groups. It seems like the U.S. blamed Bahariterra. Plus, during the same time, the U.S. government had for a long time wanted to build a military base in the Bahariterra Islands. Ever since World War II, it would have came in handy. It's in the middle of the Atlantic, halfway between Europe and North America. I mean, they have Bermuda at the time, but Bermuda's not too far from America. It's not really halfway out. Bahariterra is right near the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, right out in the middle of the Atlantic. Right? The USA had a long time always wanted to build a military base in Bahariterra. They didn't recognize Bahariterra as a real country or ever talk to leaders there or ever think about it except for one thing, and it's that we could really put a base there. So in the early 2000s, the USA seized these islands where they really want a military base, but people there keep arguing, saying, no, we don't want you to build a military base on our lands. They got these extremists at this place who are threatening America. That's more reason why the U.S. would want to have control in Bahariterra to keep themselves safe, as the U.S. does. So what ended up happening is basically a battle, a secretive wars where the only videos we have of it are so graphic and so extreme that we can't post them on YouTube, and a lot of them are copyrighted because people took videos of like cool explosions in the battle. They're so proud of these videos, they put copyright on them so that no one would steal the videos and take credit. So I don't have any way to show videos of the U.S. Bahariterra War. It's either too violent to show on YouTube or social media where it will get taken down, or it's copyrighted where the owner could sue me or have my video removed. But basically, from the early 2000s until the dictator Kalma died in 2020, there were, especially in the early 2000s, in the beginning of the 2000s, not really in the 2010s as much or near 2020 as much, but for the rest of the Kalma dictatorship, there were a couple marine battles at sea. They weren't in the U.S., they weren't in Bahariterra. People in the U.S. had really no clue about this at all, and most people in Bahariterra didn't pay attention or think about it much. But what was going on was the USA would fly airplanes towards Bahariterra, just outside of Bahariterran waters and airspace. They'd held all these ships, the Navy, the Air Force. The Bahariterran government would shoot at them. A lot of American planes and ships were destroyed, but the U.S. soldiers just kept bailing out. They'd jump out the planes and parachute. They'd jump off the aircraft carrier. They had devices to track them and be located. They'd be found and they'd be fine, just a little cold. They get wrapped in a warm blanket and recover and get on a new ship. So this fighting kept going between the U.S. and Bahariterra. The U.S. lost a bunch of aircraft and a bunch of aircraft carriers and ships, and wasn't even telling the American public about the secret war. But there weren't a lot of U.S. soldiers dying. Only a couple hundred died. But there were so many explosions and so much equipment, planes, jets, boats, that it was actually doing a damage to the U.S.'s secret fleet in the Atlantic that was basically surrounding Bahariterra, to the point where the U.S. was getting scared and thought they'd have to surrender because this small island country was doing serious damage to their naval capabilities. However, the U.S. might have not took a lot of human life damage, But Bahariterra, on the other hand, lost almost all of its aircraft carriers and thousands of its people, a huge dent in the whole population of young men and women who were sent out to fight to defend the archipelago were just completely lost and killed by the US government. To the point where, like, I think Bahariterra's population used to be like 79,000 or something like that, and to this very day it's only 63,000, despite the fact that a bunch of people want to move and live in this tropical island and people have kids and stuff and no one's moving out. Still, the population of Bahariterra is only 63,000, and it's expected to either grow a little, shrink a little, or stay the same. It might never recover from this. But still, like, the American public didn't really know about it. Back in Bahariterra, on the islands, people didn't really notice it much. The battles took place out at sea. What happened was, finally, after the communist era, which lasted 8 years from 1980 until 1988, and then from 1989 to 2020, there was this Khalmad dictatorship era. What happened was the people in Bahariterra were frustrated. There had never really been a democracy, or at least a proper one, ever in Bahariterra. There were votes and elections and different kind of like fake monarchies, you could call them, that tried to set themselves up in democracies and good governments in the 17 and 1800s, in that early period where we kind of skipped through a lot of hundreds of uneventful years only to be erupted by volcanic eruptions. There wasn't much there, so I kind of skipped that. But what happened was, by 2020, in 2019 and 2020, people started breaking the rules. In the Khalmad dictatorship, no one was supposed to post things on YouTube, but people just got a VPN, pretended that they were in another country, downloaded YouTube and made videos anyway. They watched it too. You bet, even if it was illegal, they consumed Western media and stuff. And eventually, because of this, in the Khalmad dictatorship weak, people saw how others lived in other countries where life was more better and fair. They realized that Bahariterra could have been super rich and developed, and it could have been just like Dubai. They saw how Dubai was with oil. Why didn't Bahariterra go for the same thing when they found oil? Because the dictatorship stole all the money, and only a little bit of it went to the people. That's when the people realized this guy who helped develop Bahariterra and build it is causing a little war with the largest military on earth. We might not have been invaded or hurt here, but we've lost so much family members when we sent them out to sea to fight. We're losing all our aircraft, all our weapons, and the USA is going to invade. And they see the US history. They see it on YouTube and online, on these apps they weren't supposed to look at, that they looked at anyways. The people of Bahariterra could see what happens to other countries when the US invaded. They could see Iraq and Afghanistan, and they was like, nope, that's not going to be Bahariterra. So this secret underground movement rose up to overthrow the dictatorship. It started in 2019 with groups of kids. Basically, this is the most weird way any country's government has ever been overthrown. What I'm about to tell you is the most very interesting, very weird thing you're ever going to hear. That's true history of Bahariterra. Now, what happened was, it didn't even start, alright? There were all these people who wanted to overthrow the government by 2019, but the people who originally wanted to overthrow the government didn't end up being the people who did stop the Khalmad dictatorship, alright? The people who stopped the Khalmad dictatorship was a group of kids with water guns who wanted to play. But when the dictatorship ended, it ended with real bullets and death. You're probably thinking, now what the heck is this? Well, I'll explain. In 2019, a bunch of teenagers, mainly between the ages of 13 and 15, who always hung out outside in certain neighborhoods in southern Bahariterra, near the capital city and in the capital city, Banda Bahariterra. These groups of kids would always play, but basically a large group of kids who liked to hang out and started their own little summer camp. Kids who couldn't afford to go to the expensive summer camps on the islands would basically get together and go hike in the woods, build tents and fires, and kind of had their own camps ran by themselves. These massive camps with hundreds of kids who all just wanted to be cool and hang out and build their own summer camps. They just go in the woods, find a clearing, they'd build some fires and pitch some tents and call it a camp. But there were no adults there were no real camp counselors. They even had a guy who ran papers on copy machines and printers and made fake flyers to give to their parents, claiming that their kids were going to a real free summer camp. But none of them were for free. The kids just had their own camp they made, and there were no adults or camp counselors. These parents thought, alright, my kid's going to be gone for a few days at this camp. But in reality, it wasn't a summer camp. It was just a bunch of kids playing in the woods. These geniuses, they built solar panels and stuff so they could get electricity. They stole Wi-Fi connections to play video games. They built like giant forts and tree houses in the woods and whole entire secret cities hidden in the middle of the jungle. And they like came up with ways to get rid of the mosquito population. They did amazing stuff. And the largest group of these kids who were setting up these kind of camps was called Bigfoot Squad. And yes, you may recognize the most crazy stories about the Bigfoot Squad. It's this group of kids in Bahariterra, and some of them are just now starting to grow up and reach ages around 19 and 20. Soon they will in a couple years. And some of them are reaching age 17 already. But what happened was, around the time of 2019, this group of kids called Bigfoot Squad, that was mainly between ages 13 and 15, what they were doing was they were having fighting amongst themselves, because kids fight. The Bigfoot Squad was this large group of kids who built a utopian society in the woods. They had solar-powered electricity, washers, and everything. And they could have their parents have this flyer saying that they were at a camp, when in reality they'd be going into woods building their fun little utopian societies for teenagers and preteens only. And the Bigfoot Squad built these massive forts, these solar-powered areas where they had lighting, they had heating and cooling, they had Wi-Fi, they were playing games, they even built houses. Some of the older kids who were 15 brought drills and power tools. And they were building treehouse villages up in the trees. They brought whole entire swimming pools. They siphoned waters from rivers and filtered it and cleaned it and added chlorine. And had these massive swimming pools. And there were kids jumping out of 50-foot trees in the pools. And they were just having a blast. But it sounds too good to be true, right? Well, that's because it kind of is. The kids, it wasn't all happy and sunshine. As these kids do, as kids will, there was fighting. And it caused the groups to take sides. You know, some of the most famous, like, popular kids, if you will, in the Bigfoot Squad started getting into arguments. And, you know, if you were in the Bigfoot Squad, you had to choose a side and side up with one of the main leaders, the popular kids, who called all the shots mainly and came up with these brilliant ideas of how to build this little hidden villages in the woods. And what happened was the Bigfoot Squad eventually fractured into two groups, the Bigfoot Squad and the Sasquatch Gang. The Bigfoot Squad was the largest and Sasquatch Gang was a little bit smaller. And in order to solve their problems, the two leaders of the group who saw what happened to their once utopian society, you know, angry kids tearing it down and hitting it with axes, breaking it, busting things with baseball bats, draining the pools, they realized all that they had worked hard for all summer long was about to come to an end. So the two agreed that instead of fighting and vandalizing their creations, they got both of their groups together, Bigfoot Squad and Sasquatch Gang. They decided to settle it with a war. But not a war where anyone dies. A kid war. They had Nerf guns, water guns, and they basically just attacked each other. They used pranks, shooting water balloons out of t-shirt cannons. These kids went absolutely crazy. But that didn't solve their problem because no one could agree on who was the winner. So it just went on and on. Some kids ended up like falling out of trees because they were hiding there, trying to ambush people by dropping water balloons from trees on people in rival teams. The Bigfoot Squad and the Sasquatch Gang continued to fight, and soon the summer of 2019 was coming to an end, and many of those kids wouldn't be allowed to come back until next summer. They still couldn't fix their broken society and get everyone to agree, because no one could agree on who won. So the fighting was going on, and people were getting anxious to win because the summer was coming to an end and most of those kids wouldn't be allowed to be there in the fall and winter. So they just kept one-upping each other. The attacks got more and more sophisticated. Some kids ended up setting up sawed-off shotgun traps that fired wooden corks into people, and that's when injuries got brutal. And this made people angry, so the fighting became more and more violent. The leaders lost control and authority over these two groups of kids. They got fractured even more, especially the Sasquatch gang. It got fractured into all these smaller subdivisions who kind of disagreed a little, but tried to stay united under the Sasquatch gang just so they could be Bigfoot Squad, because that's all they all cared about, and that's what they could all agree on. And what happened was, eventually, these kids ended up going freaking crazy, like sawed off real shotgun traps. Some kids sadly ended up died, and the police tried to investigate it, but there were multiple just random villages in the woods that only the local kids knew about, and if anyone snitched, they would get hurt. So the police would end up just finding these villages that were built by kids in the woods with like solar powered and built everything. There'd be no one there because the kids would have lookouts, they'd see police coming in, and they'd scramble. So the kids just kept roaming around the rainforest, meeting up in these new wooden villages. They go from wooden village to wooden village and just, plan to have these massive brawls. And so the police would start challenging kids, giving them money to tip off where the next meeting would take place, where Bigfoot Squad and Sasquatch Gang was going to fight. Because these kids started actually hurting each other, and some kids ended up dying. There were kids who fell out of 200-foot tall cypress trees and died because they were trying to ambush people with water balloons. There was a kid who had his head blasted off and died because he got shot with a sawed-off shotgun trap that was set up where he walked into a rope he didn't see on the ground under some leaves, and it blasted him in the head. So this was serious stuff. And what happened was the Bahariterra government was so caught up in trying to stop these organizations, that they labeled them as violent criminal gang-like organizations. And they sent in all these police and stuff, understandably. And a bunch of the main leaders got arrested and interrogated. Some were put behind bars and won't be released until 2040. And what happened was the Bigfoot Squad and the Sasquatch gang disagreed on everything. Alright, if there was an opinion on the weather, and the Sasquatch gang said it would be rainy, the Bigfoot Squad would say it's going to be sunny. Even if they knew it would be rainy, they'd say it's sunny just so that they don't agree with the Sasquatch gang. You see where I'm going? Politics, alright? The Sasquatch gang sided up with the Khalmed dictatorship, and the Bigfoot Squad, which was slightly larger and was more organized and not fractured as much, sided up with a democratic government. The kids in the Bigfoot Squad ended up working with adults that winter. When the winter came and the villages they built in the woods had to be abandoned till next summer, the heat got too hot, and I don't mean like physical heat, I'm saying a metaphor, meaning the cops were all over. They started just going home for the winter, planning on what they'd do next summer, hoping to end the violence, or else the police would be on them. They wouldn't be able to build their secret societies in the woods anymore. And the Bigfoot Squad, during the winter, they made plans, jokingly, to overthrow the Khalmed dictatorship. But these kids were young kids, and they didn't look like spies, so Khalmed was less paranoid around them. And they managed to watch him from the woods that surround the capital city Banda, and the hills behind the city, because Banda is a city on the coast, and behind it there's these big mountains just outside the river delta that Banda's built on. The kids would use telescopes and spy on him and watch his limousines and taxis and his groups of cars guarding him. I forget the name, but like lines of cars, like a caravan full of people guarding him, and they don't know which one he's in. But they'd watch wherever he went and get his schedule and tried to find out secrets about him. Some of them who lived in the capital Banda, members of the Bigfoot Squad, would know where he's about to go. They'd stand on a street corner and watch him ride by and listen to his phone calls and conversations if his window was down. While everyone else wasn't paying attention, they were clapping for him while he drove by. These secret kids will be spies listening on what he says he plans to do tonight while on the phone with someone. And they give this information to their parents, many of whom were also opposed to the dictatorship. And that is the ultimate reason why the parents were able to overthrow Khalmed, because these kids who were secret spies were always one step ahead of Khalmed. And they eventually succeeded in overthrowing the dictatorship and uploading 11,000 videos to YouTube before the dictatorship fell. Think about it. People in Bahariterra were not allowed on YouTube. They weren't allowed to watch it and upload videos. But kids who were in the Bigfoot squad alone managed to upload 11,000 videos inside of the Bahariterra Islands before the dictatorship fell. And this is important. Why? Because it shows what life is like growing up there and what it was like under the dictator. You can see how damaged infrastructure is in the background behind these kids. You can note like how they're talking about how milk might cost $20 a gallon. And it tells you how life was. And finally, after all that nonsense, in 2021, war hero John Sori, who fought in a kind of like small civil war battle that was going on, the Khalmed dictatorship knew it was falling apart, and Khalmed became more paranoid, and he sent, soldiers to arrest anyone who opposed him and killed them. They often ended in small gunfights, and this was called the Bahariterran Civil War by some locals. What happened was John Sori was a war hero who used a boat and maneuvered it on the jungle straits to kill a bunch of Khalmed's personal guards who were chasing him away. The jungle straits is the body of water between the two largest main islands in Bahariterra. What John Sori did was he'd be speeding down this narrow channel between the mountainous islands on his speedboat, going really fast, and he'd act like he was making a beeline for the beach so he could get off the boat and run in the woods. He'd zoom towards the beach, and all the speedboats chasing him with the Khalmed's personal guards would full throttle after him. But at the last moment, he'd maneuver and make a sharp turn to the left and continue going out down the jungle straits instead of, pulling up on this beach. The speedboats chasing him weren't as maneuverable. They couldn't slow down in time. So they just crash into the rocks and blow up, killing the guards on the boat. So imagine, you only focus on this guy, chasing him around, dodging wooden poles sticking out the ground that are there to tie boats up to. You see him making a beeline for the beach, over there, chase him. And then all of a sudden he turns to the left and you can't pull the steering wheel hard enough and turn. And you look and all you see is these rocks rushing at you. And that's your last moment. Boom. The boat explodes on impact from all the gasoline that would be in these massive gas tanks they had to use. That conveniently were put on the front of the boat, so they were sure to smash into these cliffs at high speeds. These cliffs were made out of solid, huge volcanic boulders, and they were absolutely hard, and they crushed up the metal boats, busted the tank, snapped the wires, got sparks going, kapow, explosions immediately. And John Sori somehow managed to fool them and do this over and over, literally killing almost the entirety of Khalmed's personal guards, and nobody wanted to join him. He was paranoid and he thought people were trying to kill him, and he couldn't force someone to be his guard, because then that person doesn't want to, they might kill him. And he was just so paranoid, he became more and more scared, hiding inside all day, sending people disguised as him to go run his errands for him. And eventually he became paranoid and barricaded himself inside a building with the last of his couple hundred personal guards, where a group of angry mob laid siege to this building he was hiding in. And he was so paranoid, I forget the story, but one of the guards ended up shooting another guard who was probably going to go kill Khalmed and betray Khalmed. And the other guard saw this was happening, that guy's gonna kill Khalmed. He did his job, protect the dictator. So he shot the guard who was about to betray Khalmed. And I guess maybe another guard saw this and was like, oh my goodness, that guy's gonna kill Khalmed. He's about to kill us all. He just shot one of the guards. They shot that guy, and another guy was like, no, wait. So they were all confused. All you see is a bunch of people shooting each other. And it led to an all-out shootout. Everyone killed each other, and the dictator got shot and died. Maybe on purpose, maybe in the crossfire. Almost all the people in that building were dead or injured. I don't even think a single person who lived walked out unscathed. A bunch of people were arrested, the dictator Khalmed died, and John Sori, that war hero, who made the number of his guards so small that he ended up barricading himself in there, which was what led to the dictatorship falling. When the dictator died, was known as like a war hero, and he got elected as the president of Bahariterra, and they wanted to elect him in 2020 all along. They say in 2020 and 2021 he was president, and in 2022 he got elected again. But the election for who was going to be Bahariterra's president in 2023 happened in 2022, and Abdullah bin Qal, one of his rivals, won. So now in 2023, on New Year's Day on the Gregorian calendar, which is January 1st, Abdullah bin Qal is going to be the new president of Bahariterra, and Bahariterra went from colonism to communism, almost, to a dictatorship, to a democracy, which is now known as Islamic Republic of the Bahariterra Islands. And to this very day, many of the kids in the Bigfoot Squad and Sasquatch gang are very close and get along, and some of them jokingly make threats to each other. You know, as kids who are friends do, you know, like say, oh my goodness, you look so ugly, you look like Garfield, that cat from that cartoon, you know, roasting each other. It's just playful. And to this very day, those kids are probably going to be lifelong friends who accidentally overthrew one of the most secretive and oppressive dictatorships to not make the news big like Cuba or North Korea.